Rachel said, I'm the legal advisor for UN Watch. And the mission of UN Watch is to monitor the United Nations according to the yardstick of its own charter, which means the principles of universality, impartiality, and equality on which the UN was founded. One of our main activities, of course, is combating the systemic anti-Israel discrimination at the United Nations. And as you probably know, double standards against Israel at the UN are pervasive. So let me start by going through an overview of what happens regularly at the United Nations. First, we have the General Assembly, where every year 20 to 21 resolutions are adopted against Israel and only 5 or 6 against the rest of the world combined. That includes Iran, Syria, and North Korea, which each get 1 resolution. The General Assembly adopts 0 resolutions on systematic abusers like China, Cuba, and Saudi Arabia. Then we have other UN bodies, like the Commission on the Status of Women and the World Health Organization, who every year at their annual meeting condemn only 1 country. And of course, that country is Israel. In condemning only Israel, the Commission on the Status of Women gives a free pass to serial women's rights abusers like Saudi Arabia, where the male guardianship system is highly restrictive and gives male relatives the authority to make critical decisions about women, and Iran, where women face prison for defying the forced hijab law. In condemning only Israel, the World Health Organization ignores massive health crises like Syria's bombing of hospitals and medical convoys and mass hunger in Venezuela and the collapse of its healthcare system, causing millions to flee the country. And then, of course, we have the big one, the Human Rights Council, where there are so many double standards, and I will go through, it's actually discrimination, anti-Israel discrimination, and I will go through some of that with you now. So I'll start with agenda item 7. At each Human Rights Council session, we have 10 agenda items. But Israel is the only country that is debated under a special agenda item just for it. Agenda item 7. All other countries' human rights records are discussed under the general agenda item 4, which applies to all countries. Then we have UN Human Rights Council resolutions. Every year at the Human Rights Council, Israel is condemned in at least 5 resolutions, while there are only 3 on Syria, where hundreds of thousands have been killed since 2011 and millions displaced. Other countries like Iran, which executes children, North Korea, which holds tens of thousands of political prisoners in gulag-like prison camps, and Myanmar, which is accused of genocide against Rohingya Muslims, get only 1 to 2 resolutions per year. And some of the worst abusers, like China, Cuba, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, get 0 resolutions at the United Nations Human Rights Council. And it's not just the number of resolutions, but the fact that the language of the resolutions against Israel is different from all of the other country-specific resolutions. The resolutions on Israel are suffused with one-sided political hyperbole and systematically suppress any countervailing facts or context that might provide any balance, while resolutions on other countries often contain praise and encouragement for the government. Then, of course, we have the special sessions. Israel has been the subject of more special sessions at the Human Rights Council than any other country. In the first 6 months of the Council, as the crisis in Darfur was raging, the Council held 3 special sessions on Israel and only 1 on Darfur. By the end of 2009, half of all the special sessions at the Human Rights Council had been on Israel. And like with special sessions, we also have UN Human Rights Council commissions of inquiry. There have been more Human Rights Council commissions of inquiry on Israel than on any other country. And all of these commissions of inquiry are given one-sided mandates that prejudge Israel's guilt and give a free pass to Hamas and other terrorist groups. So for example, Resolution S-28/1, which created the most recent Commission of Inquiry on Gaza on the March of Return, it called for an investigation in the context of Israel's, quote, military assaults on the large-scale civilian protests, prejudging Israel's guilt, and it didn't mention Hamas at all. Then lastly, we have the country expert. The UN has 9 human rights experts on country situations, but only the expert on Palestine has a one-sided mandate that allows him to condemn only one party to the to a conflict for violations, Israel, and completely ignored violations by the other party to the conflict, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. Actually, the language of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Palestine is, quote, to investigate Israel's violations of the principles and bases of international law. So every time we ask Michael Link, that's the name of the current Special Rapporteur on Palestine, why he is not addressing Palestinian violations like arbitrary arrest, torture, censorship by the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, the response is always the same. It's not within his mandate. So that was just a snapshot of what happens regularly at the United Nations in terms of double standards and discrimination against Israel. But everything I just summarized shows how the UN is completely one-sided against Israel. And the challenge we face so often is how can we bring some balance to the picture? For example, how can we get the UN system to scrutinize and condemn Palestinian violations of human rights? UN Watch, we're based in Geneva, the seat of the Human Rights Council, and we participate in every Human Rights Council session and many other UN human rights meetings to counterbalance the attacks on Israel. We make submissions, we speak ourselves, we bring speakers, we host side events, and we're there at the UN to stand up for Israel. So I would like to share one experience that we had regarding an intervention that we took part in this past August. As you might know, Palestine became a non-member observer state at the United Nations in 2012. And then a couple years later, they joined 5 human rights treaties, including the Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination. I'll call it the Antiracism Convention. So the good thing about these treaties is that they have treaty bodies, which are committees of experts that review state compliance at regular intervals. And by signing on to these treaties, the Palestinian Authority subjected itself to this review process, which is supposed to hold governments to account for their failure to comply with these treaties. So here we are, 5 years later, and the Palestinians are starting to be reviewed by the treaty bodies, meaning the treaty bodies should be holding them to account for violations. And the review of Palestine by the Antiracism Committee took place this past August. So it was supposed to be about the Palestinians' compliance with the Antiracism Convention. And you don't have to look that far to find all kinds of anti-Semitic incitement in the Palestinian Authority, by the Palestinian Authority officials, public statements by officials in the Palestinian Authority and Hamas media, in the educational system. But despite the pervasive anti-Semitism in Palestinian society, we were very surprised to find that the Palestinian Authority report to the committee focused on repeatedly blaming the, quote, Israeli occupation for countless alleged violations of Palestinian rights, while seeking to evade responsibility for its own racism and discrimination. There was a complete denial that racism exists among Palestinians. The PA report went so far as to say that it had not, quote, detected any racist discourse within Palestinian society. Instead of acknowledging its own anti-Semitic and terrorist incitement, the PA report accused Israel of inciting racial discrimination and violence against Palestinians. The PA report ignored Palestinian attacks on Jewish worshipers and Jewish religious sites, while it accused Israel of preventing Palestinians from exercising their religious rights. It also did not address its own violence and discrimination against Christians. The PA report did not address the fact that, as Professor Kantorovich mentioned, no Jews live in the Palestinian-controlled territories, even though 21% of Israel's population is Arab. In essence, the Palestinians were doing more of the usual at the UN, exploiting the reporting process of the Anti-Racism Committee as yet another UN vehicle to attack Israel while shirking their own obligations. But in this case, they were appearing before an expert body which was mandated to look at the Palestinians' performance, specifically on the issue of racism. So we used our speaking opportunities to point out the deficiencies in the Palestinian Authority report and to expose their own hypocrisy and double standards. In our private meeting with the committee, where we were joined by NGO Monitor and Impact SE, as well as a representative from the pro-Palestinian NGO Al-Haq. We were able to have an intimate face-to-face dialogue with some of the committee members. We were able to remind them again and again that the review was about Palestine, not Israel. We were able to answer their questions and respond to some of the absurd claims being made by the Al-Haq representatives. And when the official review began later in the afternoon, we could already see the impact that we had had on the committee members. They asked the Palestinian Authority tough questions like, how do they explain the anti-Semitic incitement in Palestinian media and in the statements of state officials? How does the PA plan to tackle anti-Semitism in textbooks? Is there a Jewish minority in Palestine? And how are Jews and other minorities represented in the media? Unhappy with these questions, when the Palestinian Authority representative took the floor, he attacked us, labeling our submission to the committee as propaganda. But to its credit, the committee did not take up the Palestinians' invitation to turn the review into another attack on Israel. And in its concluding observations, which were published a few weeks later, it urged the Palestinian Authority to combat hate speech and incitement to violence, making an express finding that hate speech against Israelis fuels hatred and may incite violence and anti-Semitism. So what we learned from the experience is that even though, and no matter how one-sided the UN is when it comes to Israel, it's so important for us to use every opportunity given by the UN system to refute the mainstream UN narrative, which is very much against Israel.